Updating the transparency criteria for 2024. I'm proud to say that as the transparency champion, the chair of the Transparency Scientific Committee, we just updated our transparency criteria for 2024. I'm joined today by Jenn Cooney and Molly Doran, who have been working very hard behind the scenes to update these criteria. Jenn is chair of Labrador's advisory practice. Molly's been working in the advisory practice for a long time. Today on realtransparentdisclosure.com. The new transparency criteria. So unlike the corporatecounsel.net, where I got to hire my own people when I decided to take on this hat of transparency champion, and I got to work with Jenn and Molly. I knew them, but I did not know how brilliant they are. And so they truly have carried the ball here with the transparency criteria as I get up to speed. And they've been amazing to work with. So I want to thank you both so much for doing such an amazing job in this very important mission that I believe in strongly. So Molly's been involved the longest. We're going to have Molly start by talking to us about the history of the Transparency Awards, because it goes back quite a long way.
Yeah, thank you, Broc. So in 2009 in France, Labrador launched the first ever grand prize of transparency, which is now the Transparency Awards. And in 2009, the methodology and the entire process was established. And not until 10 years later, in 2019, did Labrador US begin the Transparency Awards. Now, and fast forward to 2023, when we introduced the ESG report for the first time, and now 2024, moving forward, we have just announced that we have a scientific committee in place to help oversee the awards process, criteria, updates, etc. And that's a little bit about the history of the Transparency Awards. They've been around for quite some time now.
Thanks, Molly. And the Transparency Scientific Committee is a group of 7 people right now that I recruited that represent the interests of all stakeholders. The transparency mission that we have primarily looks through the eyes of the reader of these disclosure documents. And so we have a wide variety of experience on the committee. We have a former SEC general counsel, Dan Gelzer, became general counsel, I think, when he was 35. And then he was one of the founding board members for the PCAOB, one of the most distinguished lawyers I know. He's a lawyer, even though he was served on the PCAOB board for, I think, 15 years. And then we have 3 former chairs of the Society of Corporate Governance, and not just any chairs of the society. These are some of the most well-known chairs that really have served as mentors for so many of the in-house people out there. And they really bring a great perspective. We have institutional investor, Don Anderson from T. Rowe. We have Courtney with an ESG background at Glass Lewis. And then we have me as the chair of the committee. And so I'm pretty excited about the committee. We'll continue to add to it, but the wide variety of perspectives has really helped during the deliberations of updating the criteria to make sure that sort of all corners are peeked around and that we're not missing anything. Jenn, you want to talk about the 5 pillars of transparency?
So my first year working on this, I really had to think through sort of what are the goals here? What do we consider transparency? Broc talked a lot about this, and it is sort of the reason for these awards. So I think the pillars help explain sort of what we're looking for in the criteria, how the criteria relate directly to transparency. So we have accessibility. That's really about, can the reader find the information they want quickly? We have precision. Are you using the real estate of your disclosures in the right way? Are you talking about things that the readers want to read about? Is the document comparable? Does it enable comparability, I should say? And that's maybe from company to company, but also, can I get at the information such that I can compare it against my expectations or my voting guidelines? And then availability, can I find the information I want in the document, in the format that I'm looking for? That could be, I want a courtesy PDF. filed with the SEC so that I can view in a PDF form, or that could be IR website type criteria. Can I easily find on the website exactly what I'm looking for? And then last but not least is clarity. We've talked about plain English for years in corporate disclosures, and we want to make sure that we're focused on that too, in terms of transparency.
Yeah, it's amazing to me how clarity is still sometimes often forgot, even though plain English has been around for a long time. But lawyers can be lawyers sometimes and get lost in the morass. Molly, do you want to talk about the annual process of proposing new and modified criteria?
Yeah. So each criteria is associated with a pillar, one of the 5 pillars of transparency. And once the awards have happened and they have been released for the year, we analyze the data internally and look at year-over-year trends. Along with that, we also are looking at any updates to voting guidelines and or investor feedback. And part of the scientific committee and their role is to help us identify and approve these changes to the awards. So each year we present the modifications, the additions, the deletions, and any text updates to the scientific committee. And they formally approve the changes or do not approve the changes. And that is how we update the criteria year over year. It's a joint process.
Yeah, and we just held the first meeting of the committee. Until you hold that first meeting, you really don't know how the committee is going to work and how seriously they take this job. And trust me, they took it very seriously. We spent time on each of the new criteria. And I would say for every criteria that got approved as proposed, there was another criteria that was either deleted or significantly modified. And so there was quite a bit of discussion. I was actually a little bit surprised. And there was great, and a number of criteria were actually tabled for further discussion for future years. And so I'm looking forward to having such an energetic committee do this work. We also approved the committee's charter since it was our first meeting. So I was pleasantly surprised and glad that I'm working with the people that I'm working with. So let's talk about the actual final criteria that were approved. Jen, you want to talk about some of those, highlight some of the new ones?
Yeah, great. So I'll just highlight a couple here to sort of give a sense of the types of criteria that we're looking at, to what Molly said, sort of really trying to get at sort of what is a trend or how expectations have changed. So for the new ones, for example, we added a dedicated section or subsection call out directly relating to director succession planning or refreshment. In the past, there was a criteria, but it was a little bit mixed with how you go identify and select a new director. And this one, from the committee's perspective, seemed to really be more about what is the board doing about refreshment more generally. So this one calls for a little bit more about the approach than the steps of going to find a new director when one is needed. Another one, pretty basic, but from a reader's perspective, that is in CDNA of the proxy when you're about to discuss all the details of the long-term incentives. What is the incentive mix? How is that value divided among performance shares, time vested stock options? But having that discussion of mix, that graphic of mix, right as you're about to go into the details is helpful. There was discussion about criteria related to auditor disclosures in the proxy, something that certainly I feel like was a hot topic several years ago, and sort of drifted away as a rule proposed, but came back to, and the committee did think that we should have a criteria that at least requires you to say how long of a tenure your auditor has. So that's one in the audit section to consider. Switching away from the proxy, ESG, we learned a lot after our first year doing the ESG reports. And we added a couple that are industry specific. And this was something that required some thought. I mean, biodiversity isn't necessarily critical to all companies, but it's material to some, depending on the industry. So we batted around the best way to do this. And so there are a number of new criteria, biodiversity being one, water, circularity, product safety, employee safety, that will be industry based. And to keep that objective, at least for this year, while SASB is still relevant, and SASB's industry specific classifications, to determine whether or not these topics are directly applicable to these companies. And, even if SASB says that this may be material to your industry, we will also look in your ESG report. And if you have prioritized topics and discussed your materiality assessment, and you have determined that this topic is not a material topic for you, then it would not be applicable. So we're trying to give the benefit of, thinking about industries, but also acknowledging that each company is individual and we want to respect the assessment that they've done. And then last but not least, another new criteria applicable to IR websites is that ability to search by filing type. So I think a lot of companies actually do have that, but when we're trying to go and find a particular document on the IR site, the ability to select proxy or annual report or 8Ks really reduces the number of clicks necessary to find the information that you're looking for.
And then, Jen, what about any deletions or modifications to the criteria? Can you speak to any highlights there?
Yeah, so I think the deleted, for the most part, were criteria that were covered elsewhere. So for example, there had been criteria specifically on human capital management highlights in the proxy. And while we think that's still something important to talk about for some companies, we found that it's often mixed in with the ESG highlights under social. And so rather than try to be prescriptive of you should have human capital management highlights or try to steer companies to have a header, or we really wanted the flexibility there and felt it's, we already have ESG highlights as a requirement criteria, it was too confusing to have them separate. Another example were some of the cybersecurity criteria for ESG reports, knowing now that there are rules and 10K required disclosures. It made more sense to, again, provide flexibility for companies of what then they're going to put in their other reports, and really just be more broad and have the criteria for ESG and cybersecurity be general approach as opposed to specific, you should talk about XYZ. And then on the updated criteria, a lot of them were taking sort of two thoughts that were stuck in one criteria. Often that's related to graphics. So there had been a criteria that in your company overview, you will talk about financial highlights or strategy using visual elements. And so it's now split up. Your company overview includes visual elements. Your company overview includes financial highlights or strategy, but really to, give companies the opportunity to sort of have two separate criteria, but also they serve two different purposes. The visual elements may go more towards accessibility of information, and what is actually in there, the content might be more that precision pillar. So really trying to, make the criteria easier to follow, easier to meet. And there's similar, that example is similar for both proxy and ESG, just as another sort of example of the updates. The ESG company overview previously included revenue as part of sort of discussing your company scale. And, from the benchmarking that they've done, over the years, it's just not something that we found really part of that discussion. revenue and economic impact is very much a ESG topic and something to consider in disclosures, but not necessarily sort of needing to be in this about the company section. So I think where possible, we'd like to give companies flexibility in where they're discussing everything, and what works best for their story. And so a lot of the updated criteria and the thinking behind it is trying to provide that flexibility.
And if you all have any questions, Broc blogged about this on realtransparentdisclosure.com, and you can take a look at the 2024 criteria that have been updated and released.
Great. Thanks very much, Molly and Jen, again, for your help getting me through this first year as transparency champion. Thanks.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Broc.
Broc.